In the autumn of 1780, the British Army in the American South believed the war was already over. They had captured Charleston. They had shattered an entire Continental Army at Camden on the 16th of August. General Charles Cornwallis was writing letters to London that spoke of South Carolina as a conquered province, a pacified colony, a stepping stone to Virginia, and the swift end of the rebellion. The maps in his headquarters showed garrisons strung across the state like nails holding down a lid. And then, one by one, those garrisons began to vanish into the cypress swamps along the Pee Dee and the Santee rivers, and the patrols sent to find the men responsible came back fewer than they left, or did not come back at all. The man the British could not catch was named Francis Marion. He was small, sickly, fewer than 5 feet tall by some accounts, with a face scarred by smallpox and an ankle that had never healed right after he leapt from a second-story window to escape a drinking party he did not want to attend. He commanded, at most, a few dozen men at a time, sometimes as few as 20, riding half-starved horses through water up to their saddle girths. He had no artillery. He had no supply train. He had no uniforms worth the name. And over the next year, this man would do more to unravel Britain's hold on the South than any general fielding a proper army. Because Francis Marion had understood something Cornwallis had not. He had understood that the swamp was not an obstacle to war. The swamp was the weapon. So how did a man with no army, no cannon, and no supplies use the land itself to swallow a victorious empire whole? Here is exactly what I am going to walk you through. The first is the specific reason the Battle of Camden in August of 1780 was so total a disaster for the Americans that it convinced the British the South was finished, and why that conviction was the seed of their undoing. The second is the precise geography of the Pee Dee swamps, and how Marion turned terrain that the British saw as worthless into a fortress no 18th century army could storm. The third is the exact pattern of his raids, the timing, the targeting, the night marches of 40 and 50 miles that made him impossible to pin down and impossible to ignore. The fourth is the personal duel between Marion and the British Dragoon commander Banastra Tarleton, the chase that gave Marion his name, the Swamp Fox, and revealed the fatal flaw in the British way of war. And the fifth is the strategic result, how a few hundred men in the marshes forced Cornwallis to make the decision that led him, step by step, to a small tobacco port in Virginia called Yorktown. I should be clear about what I am and am not. I am not a military historian by trade. What I work from is the written record these men left behind, the after-action reports, the letters between Cornwallis and his subordinates, the memoirs of the men who rode with Marion, and the careful work of the historians who have spent careers reconstructing this campaign. Where the record is contested, I will say so. The Southern Campaign of the American Revolution is one of the most thoroughly documented guerrilla wars of the pre-modern age, and the documents tell a story that is stranger and harder than the legend. To understand why the swamp mattered, you have to understand Camden first, because Camden is the catastrophe that makes everything after it possible. By the summer of 1780, the war in the North had ground to a stalemate. Washington and the main Continental Army watched the British in New York, and neither side could land a killing blow. So Britain turned south to the Carolinas and Georgia, where they believed Loyalist sentiment ran strong and the rebellion was thinnest. In May, they took Charleston, and with it more than 5,000 American soldiers, the single largest surrender of American troops in the entire war. The Continental Congress scraped together a new army and sent it south under General Horatio Gates, the man credited with the great victory at Saratoga 3 years earlier. Gates marched his men hard through country that could not feed them. By the time he reached the vicinity of Camden in August, his soldiers were sick with dysentery, half of them from eating unripe corn and green peaches because there was nothing else. He had perhaps 3,000 men fit to fight, most of them untested militia. Against him stood about 2,000 British and Loyalist regulars under Cornwallis, professional soldiers, the finest line infantry in the world. On the morning of the 16th of August, the two armies collided in the half-light before dawn. Cornwallis ordered his regulars forward against the American left, where the militia stood, and the regulars came on with fixed bayonets, in silence, then with a shout. The Virginia and North Carolina militia had never seen a bayonet charge. Most of them had never fired their muskets in anger. They broke before the British even reached them. Hundreds threw down loaded weapons and ran without firing a shot. Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, was carried away in the rout, and he did not stop riding until he was 60 miles from the battlefield, then 180 miles in 3.5 days, abandoning his own army. The Continental regulars on the American right, the Maryland and Delaware line, fought on with a courage that should be remembered better than it is. They held, they counterattacked, they were surrounded, and they were destroyed. Their commander, Baron de Kalb, took 11 wounds and died of them 3 days later. When it was over, the American army in the South had effectively ceased to exist. Cornwallis had lost a few hundred men. He had won as complete a victory as any British general would win in the entire war. And this is the trap that history lays for the victorious. Camden told Cornwallis that the regular American army in the South was finished, and in that he was correct. But it told him something else that was false. It told him the South was conquered. Because if you have just annihilated your enemy's army, what is left to fear? He spread his men out into a chain of fortified posts: Camden, 96, Augusta, Georgetown, Cheraw, the better to hold the country and recruit the Loyalists he was sure were waiting. He turned his attention north, toward North Carolina and the great prize of Virginia. The South, in his mind, was a settled question. But 2 days before Camden, on the 14th of August, a small column of mounted men had ridden away from Gates's doomed army on a separate errand, sent to scout the lower Santee. Their commander had been given the assignment in part because the regular officers found him strange, ill-dressed, and difficult to work with, and were glad to see him gone. That officer was Francis Marion. He was not at Camden. His tiny command survived the disaster precisely because it was somewhere else, in the swamps, where no proper army wanted to be. And when the news of the catastrophe reached him, Marion did not despair, and he did not flee. He looked at the country around him, the black water and the cypress and the tangled cane, and he saw what no British officer would see for another year. He saw the place where an empire could be made to bleed to death, one patrol at a time. To understand the weapon Marion wielded, you have to understand the ground, because the ground is everything in this story. The low country of South Carolina, between the fall line and the sea, is a landscape that an 18th century European army was simply not built to operate in. The great rivers, the Pee Dee, the Santee, the Black, the Waccamaw, do not run in tidy channels. They spread. In wet seasons, they flood across miles of bottomland into a maze of cypress swamp, Blackwater Creek, and floating bog where the water is stained the color of strong tea and the bottom is mud that will take a horse to its belly. Spanish moss hangs from the trees. The cane grows in thickets a man cannot push through. There are no roads worth the name, only causeways and fords and hidden trails known to the men who hunted and trapped there. In summer, the heat is murderous, and the mosquitoes carry malaria, what they called the ague, which killed more British soldiers in the South than American bullets ever did. To a British officer trained on the open fields of Europe, this was wasteland. You could not march a column through it in good order. You could not deploy a battalion in line. You could not bring up artillery because the guns would sink. You could not even keep your powder dry. Cornwallis's army was a machine optimized for a particular kind of battle, men standing shoulder to shoulder in the open, trading disciplined volleys until one side's nerve broke. In that kind of fight, the British were the best in the world, and Camden had proved it. But the machine only worked on the ground it was designed for. Take it off that ground, and it became something else. A column of hot, tired, frightened men strung out along a causeway with swamp on both sides, unable to see, unable to maneuver, unable to bring their discipline to bear. Marion's men, by contrast, had grown up in this country. They were planters and farmers and hunters from the Williamsburg district and the Pee Dee. Men who knew which trails were passable in which season, which fords were guarded and which were not, which islands of high ground hid in the heart of the swamp where a camp could be made that no stranger would ever find. They rode small, tough horses, marsh tackies, bred to the wet country, that could pick their way through mud that would founder a heavy British charger. They carried what they could on their saddles and lived off the land, off corn ground at hidden mills, off cattle driven into the swamp, off sweet potatoes dug from cleared patches deep in the bottoms. Marion's base became Snow's Island, a stretch of high ground at the junction of Lynch's River and the Pee Dee, ringed by swamp and water, approachable only by trails his men controlled. From there, he could strike out in any direction and vanish again before the British could react. He built no fort. He needed none. The swamp was the fort, and its walls were 100 square miles of black water that the British could not cross and dared not enter. This is the thing that the legend of the swamp fox tends to obscure with romance. Marion was not simply brave, though he was. He was not simply clever, though he was that too. He had grasped a principle that armies would not formally articulate for another century and a half. He understood that you do not have to defeat a stronger enemy in battle. You have to deny him the kind of battle he is good at, and force him into the kind he is not. The swamp let him do exactly that. It nullified every British advantage, the artillery, the disciplined volleys, the heavy cavalry, the numbers. And it amplified every advantage Marion had, the local knowledge, the mobility, the ability to disappear. He turned the map inside out. The garrisons that Cornwallis had planted to control the country became, instead, a string of targets, each one isolated, each one surrounded by an ocean of swamp that belonged to Francis Marion. Now, how do you actually fight a war like this? Because a swamp does not win battles by itself. The genius was in the pattern. Marion's method was almost mathematical in its consistency. He would gather his men in secret, often only a few dozen, sometimes as many as a couple of hundred when the militia turned out for a particular operation. He would learn, through a network of sympathetic farmers and slaves and the men's own scouting, the exact location and strength of a British target, a supply convoy moving between posts, a small garrison, a party of loyalist militia gathering to march. Then he would move at night. The night march was the heart of it. Marion's men routinely covered 40, 50, even 60 miles in the dark, through swamp and over hidden fords, to arrive at a place the enemy thought was safely behind the lines. They would strike at dawn, or in the grey hours before it, when sentries were tired and the camp was asleep. The attack was fast and violent and short. They would scatter the enemy, free the prisoners, burn the supplies or carry them off, take the horses and the muskets and the powder, and then, before any relief could be organized, they would be gone, melting back into the swamp by trails the pursuers could not follow. By the time a British column arrived to avenge the raid, there was nothing to fight but cypress trees and tea-colored water. Consider one episode, late in August of 1780, just days after the catastrophe at Camden. A British detachment was marching about 150 American prisoners taken in the battle north toward Charleston, escorted by regulars confident that the war in this country was finished. Marion learned of the column. He took perhaps 50 men, marched them through the night, and fell on the escort at Nelson's Ferry on the Santee before dawn. The fight lasted minutes, He killed or captured the guards and freed the prisoners. It was a tiny action by the standards of European war, a skirmish, a footnote. But its meaning was enormous. 2 weeks after Camden told the British the South was theirs, here was proof that it was not, that the country between their garrisons was contested ground, that no convoy and no patrol was safe. The freed prisoners carried the story everywhere. The legend began to grow, and so did the militia turning out to ride with the strange little colonel in the swamps. The targeting was deliberate. Marion did not waste men attacking strongpoints. He went after the connective tissue of the British occupation, the convoys, the messengers, the small posts, the loyalist musters. An army holding a hostile country does not live on its battles. It lives on its supply lines and its communications, and its ability to recruit local support. Marion attacked all three. He intercepted dispatches so that Cornwallis's commanders could not coordinate. He destroyed supplies so that the garrisons went hungry. And above all, he attacked the loyalists, the Americans who had taken up arms for the king, because the entire British strategy in the South depended on raising a loyalist army to hold the country once the regulars moved on. Every time Marion smashed a loyalist muster, every time he made it clear that taking the king's side meant a raid in the night, he poisoned the well the British were trying to drink from. Men who might have joined the loyalist militia stayed home. Men who had joined drifted away. The local foundation Cornwallis needed never set, and the British could not stop it. They tried. This is the part that reveals the trap most clearly. A conventional army responds to a guerrilla by sending out columns to find and destroy him. And that is precisely what the British did, and precisely what played into Marion's hands. Every column they sent into the swamp country was a column marching off the ground it was good at, onto the ground Marion owned. The pursuers were tired, hungry, sickened by the malaria, harassed by ambushes, and they never, not once, managed to bring Marion to the kind of stand-up fight where their discipline and numbers would tell. He would not be fixed. He chose every engagement, struck when he had the advantage, and refused battle when he did not. The British was swinging at smoke, which brings us to the man Cornwallis finally sent to end the problem, and the chase that gave Francis Marion his name. Bannister Tarleton was 26 years old, the son of a Liverpool merchant, and the most feared cavalry commander in the British Army in America. He had earned that fear. In May of 1780, at the Waxhaws, his dragoons had cut down a force of surrendering Virginians in a slaughter that the Americans never forgot. And Tarleton's quarter became a bitter phrase across the South, meaning no quarter at all. No mercy. He was aggressive, fast, and ruthless, the British answer to a war of movement. If anyone could catch a man who moved fast and struck hard, it was Tarleton. In November of 1780, Cornwallis turned him loose on Marion. Tarleton drove his green-coated British Legion hard through the country between the Santee and the Pee Dee, hunting. And for a time, it seemed he might succeed. Because Tarleton understood speed in a way most British officers did not. He pushed his men through long marches, burned the plantations of known patriots to deny Marion's support and to terrorize the country into submission, and pressed the pursuit with real relentlessness. But pressing a pursuit and catching your quarry are not the same thing, and the swamp made all the difference. Marion stayed always a step ahead, falling back through the bottomlands, drawing Tarleton deeper into country where the dragoons' heavy horses bogged down and the trails forked and vanished. The story, as it has come down, is that after one long and fruitless chase of some 25 miles through swamp and thicket, with his men and horses exhausted and Marion having slipped away yet again into a great morass, Tarleton reined in and gave it up. He is supposed to have said of the country ahead that, "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." The exact words may be embroidered. The frustration behind them was real. And it was that frustration, the spectacle of Britain's best cavalrymen beaten by a swamp and a sickly little colonel, that fixed the name forever. The swamp fox. It spread through the country like fire through dry cane, and every man who heard it understood what it meant. The British could not win here. The land would not let them. That is the deeper truth the chase revealed. Tarleton's whole method, terror and speed, the burned plantations, the relentless pursuit, was perfectly suited to breaking a conventional enemy and perfectly useless against this one. The burnings did not cow the patriots. They enraged them and drove more men into the swamp to ride with Marion. The pursuit did not catch him. It only wore out British horses and British soldiers in a country that was killing them with fever. Tarleton was the sharpest instrument the British had, and the swamp turned it in their hand. After Tarleton came others, sent to do what he could not, and they failed as he had failed, for the same reasons. There was no answer to Marion within the British way of war, because the problem was not Marion. The problem was the ground, and the British could not change the ground. So what did all of it amount to? A few dozen men, a few hundred at most, raiding convoys and burning supplies in a remote corner of one colony. How does that undo an empire? This is where the small war joins the large one, and the answer is the whole point. Marion was not alone. Across the Carolina backcountry, the same war was being fought by other partisan leaders. Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, in the central Piedmont, Andrew Pickens in the west, and the Over-Mountain men who had destroyed a loyalist army at Kings Mountain in October of 1780. Together, these partisans created a condition the British had not planned for and could not manage. They made the South ungovernable. The country between the British garrisons was never pacified. The loyalist militia the whole strategy depended on could never be safely raised. Supplies could not move without escort, and escorts could be ambushed. Intelligence could not be trusted. Every soldier the British committed to chasing partisans was a soldier not available for the main campaign. And in December of 1780, the Continental Congress sent south a new commander to lead what regular forces remained. A former Quaker iron founder from Rhode Island named Nathaniel Greene. And Greene understood at once how to use the war Marion and the others were already fighting. Greene did something that should not have worked. He divided his already smaller army in the face of a stronger enemy, sending part of it under Daniel Morgan into the west, where in January of 1781, Morgan lured Tarleton into a perfectly laid trap at Cowpens and destroyed his command in under an hour. Greene then led Cornwallis on a long, grinding chase across the Carolinas, fighting battles he often lost on the field, but which cost Cornwallis men he could not replace. Greene's own summary of his method was exact. We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. He was losing battles and winning the war, and he could do it only because the partisans, Marion above all, had made the country itself an active participant in the fight, controlling the rivers and the swamps and the lines of communication, so that the regular army could maneuver in a land that was friendly to it and hostile to the enemy. The cumulative weight of it broke Cornwallis's strategy. He could not hold the South because the South would not be held. He could not destroy Greene's army because every time he came close, Greene slipped away across a river that Marion's men controlled. He bled men at battles like Guilford Courthouse, where he won the field and lost a quarter of his army. And so Cornwallis made a fateful decision. Unable to subdue the Carolinas, he convinced himself that the source of the trouble lay farther north, in Virginia, and he marched his battered army out of the Carolinas to seek a decision there. He left the very ground he had supposedly conquered, abandoning the strategy of holding the South, and that march led him, in the late summer of 1781, to a position on the Virginia coast at a small port called Yorktown, where a combined American and French army and a French fleet would close the trap. The surrender at Yorktown in October of 1781 effectively ended the war. Pull the thread all the way back, and it runs through the swamp. The British won the Battle of Camden so completely that they believed the South was theirs, and that belief led them to scatter their strength into garrisons across a country they did not actually control. Marion saw that the swamp could nullify their every advantage, and he turned the captured South into a place where no convoy was safe and no loyalist could be raised. The pursuit of him wore out their best troops and their best commander and accomplished nothing. The ungovernable country he helped create let Greene fight his losing-to-win campaign, which bled Cornwallis until he abandoned the South for Virginia, and Virginia ended the war. The swamp swallowed the British army, not in a single battle, but slowly, patrol by patrol, convoy by convoy, until the whole structure of the occupation collapsed under its own weight. There is one more move in this story that even careful tellings tend to pass over, and it is worth your attention because it is where Marion proved he was more than a raider. After Greene returned to the field in 1781, Marion did something a pure guerrilla almost never manages. He made the transition from harassment to siege. With Greene's regulars and Henry Lee's legion, Marion took part in reducing the chain of British posts one by one: Fort Watson, Fort Mott, Georgetown. At Fort Watson, lacking artillery to breach the walls, his men built, on the suggestion of a militia colonel named Hezekiah Mayhem, a tall log tower, higher than the fort's stockade, and put marksmen at the top to fire down into the defenses until the garrison surrendered. It was improvisation of exactly the kind the whole campaign demanded. A man with no cannon, inventing a way to take a fortified place, with logs and rifles and patience. The lesson in it is the one that runs through the entire war in the South. The side that wins is not always the side with the better weapons. It is often the side that better understands the ground it is fighting on, and is willing to fight the war that ground allows, rather than the war it would prefer. Francis Marion did not look like a conqueror. He was small and scarred and unwell, dressed in clothes a British officer would have given to a servant, commanding a few dozen men on half-starved horses in a corner of the war that the great strategists in London never thought about. He fought no Camden, no Saratoga, no Yorktown. He won no battle that would fill a page in a textbook. And he did more to break Britain's grip on the American South than any general with a proper army, because he understood the one thing his enemy never grasped. The swamp was not in the way of the war. The swamp was the war, and it belonged to him. If you found this story worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps these long-form histories reach the people who would want to find them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one.